She was a child of the wilderness, left to fend for herself by the bend of a lonely river. But the choice she made on this particular evening, an act of pure compassion for a struggling soul, would summon 24 riders to her door by morning, and forever alter the course of 2 separate destinies. A faint cry, nearly lost in the rush of the river, reached her ears as twilight began to bleed across the land. The girl, Elara, not yet 9 years of age, let the bundle of kindling fall from her arms. The sound that had reached her was not the call of any night bird. It was the sound of desperation. Through the twilight mist that veiled the water's surface, her eyes found its source. Another child, about her own age, was struggling in the shallow but swift rapids, one leg clearly injured as she fought against the river's relentless pull. Most children of the frontier would have retreated to the safety of family, to the shelter of a father's watch. But Elara had no one to run to. The tiny log cabin behind her held only the memory of her grandmother, who had passed in the spring. Since then, she was entirely alone. Perhaps it was that profound loneliness that forged her courage. The warnings from her grandmother, the campfire tales of raids and the dangers that lurked beyond the settlement, all cautioned her to fear the native people. But what her eyes saw was not a kind. What she saw was another child, hurt and desperate. The strange girl's dark hair was plastered to her face as she gasped, reaching hopelessly for the far bank. Her injured leg could not bear her weight against the river stones. Each time she tried to rise, the current knocked her down again. Fear and pain swam in her eyes when she finally spotted Elara on the opposite shore. For a long moment, they simply stared at one another across the divide. 2 children from 2 different worlds. One drowning while the other watched. And so, pushing aside a lifetime of warnings, Elara stepped into the frigid embrace of the river. The current, a living thing, clawed at the hem of her simple dress, trying to pull her downstream. Her small boots slipped on stones slick with algae, and more than once the river threatened to claim her, too. But she pressed onward, one determined step at a time, across the treacherous channel. When she finally reached the girl's side, the damage was plain to see. A badly swollen leg, twisted at an angle that spoke of broken bone, and fresh cuts marking her arms. The native girl cried out in a tongue Elara could not comprehend. But there is no translation needed for the look of gratitude that shines through pain. Together, with a strength born of necessity, they managed to fight their way to the safer, shallower water near Elara's side of the river. Getting her from the river was one battle. Getting her up the slick, muddy bank was another war entirely. The injured girl could offer no help, her weight a heavy burden for a child as slight as Elara. It was a slow, grueling ascent, half drag, half carry, until at last they collapsed through the rough-hewn doorway of the cabin. Inside, the world was reduced to the sound of dripping water, and their own ragged breaths. Elara retrieved what was left of her grandmother's things, a small box of salves and linen bandages. She worked with a quiet purpose, her small hands moving with a memory taught by the woman who had raised her. She cleaned the dirt and grit from the girl's wounds. She fashioned a splint from 2 pieces of kindling and strips torn from an old shift. The hardest part came last. The bone needed setting. The native girl's eyes clenched shut, her jaw set tight, but no cry escaped her lips. A silent testament to a spirit forged in hardship. And Elara, with a deep breath, did what had to be done, her touch both firm and full of grace. Later, by the flickering light of the small hearth, they shared what little food Elara had. A piece of dried venison and a handful of nuts. No words passed between them, for they had none to share. But in the shared warmth, in the quiet exchange of glances, a silent understanding was forged. A language older than any tribe or nation. The girl's fever began to subside. a hint of life returning to her cheeks as she drifted into an exhausted sleep. But what Elara could not know, in the quiet solitude of her small world, was that this child was not merely lost. She was the daughter of a great chief, a beacon of hope for her people. And at that very moment, 24 of his most skilled trackers were closing in, their determined hunt leading them, step by step, to the single, lonely light of a cabin by the river. Sleep had just begun to claim her, there on the hard plank floor, wrapped in her grandmother's quilt. But it was not the morning sun that pulled her from her dreams. It was a tremor in the earth itself. A low, growing rumble that became the thunder of 100 hooves. She sat bolt upright, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. Through the narrow gaps between the logs of the cabin wall, she saw them. Riders. They had formed a silent, unbroken ring around her home, their faces like stone in the pale dawn. Feathers stirred in their hair, and the first light of day glinted off the cold steel at their sides. Every escape was cut off. On the bed, the girl stirred, her eyes opening to the sound. But where Elara felt terror, the girl's face transformed with a look of radiant joy. She tried to sit up, calling out in her own tongue words that sounded like a celebration. But the reply from the riders was not a chorus of welcome. It was the sharp sound of harsh commands, and the unmistakable metallic rasp of weapons being drawn. Through the window, Elara saw the lead rider dismount. He moved with a grave and terrible purpose that sent a wave of ice through her veins. In that instant, every fearful story she had ever been told came rushing back. Homesteads burned to ash. Children who vanished in the night. She had saved a life, yes, but in doing so, it seemed she had forfeited her own. The girl must have seen the stark fear on Elara's face. She reached out, her grip surprisingly strong, and squeezed Elara's hand. Her eyes were urgent, pointing to herself, then to the door, her meaning clear even across the barrier of language. I will tell them. But would they listen? Or was her simple kindness already seen as a crime? The footsteps outside drew near. The low murmur of voices carried through the thin walls, the tone grim, laced with what sounded like anger. The native girl, leaning heavily on the wall, struggled to her feet. She looked at Elara, and in that moment, they both knew. Everything was about to change. Then came the knock. 3 solid strikes that seemed to shake the small cabin to its foundation. But it was not the splintering crash of an axe she had braced for. It was controlled, authoritative, almost respectful. Still, Elara's hand trembled as she reached for the simple wooden latch, knowing that on the other side of that door, her entire world waited to be decided. The door swung inward, revealing a man who seemed to block out the morning sun. He was taller than any man Elara had ever seen, his shoulders as broad as the doorway itself. His face was a map of trials and authority, marked with the paint of ceremony and of war. But the hard light in his eyes, the gaze that had faced down warriors and settlers alike, it dissolved the moment it found the girl. He spoke a single word, her name, a sound of infinite relief. Brightwater. And Brightwater answered with a torrent of words in her native tongue. Her voice was a river of urgent explanation, her hands weaving the story. She pointed to Elara, to the crude but careful splint, to the empty bowl that had held their meal. And as she spoke, the heavy tension in the air began to thin, like smoke caught in a breeze. The chief's stern face softened into something approaching awe. To leave no doubt, Brightwater, leaning on the wall, reenacted the tale. She showed them her fall into the raging water, her struggle, and then she showed them Elara, wading in without hesitation. She acted out the slow journey to the cabin, her face tight with the memory of pain, her eyes filled with gratitude. When she was finished, the great chief turned his gaze fully upon Elara. A long silence. And then, he did something that defied all stories. Something his own men had never witnessed. The warrior, the leader, the chief, lowered himself onto one knee, bringing his powerful world down to the level of a single, small child. He spoke in English, the words careful and fractured, but they carried the weight of a mountain. You saved my heart. He touched his own chest, then gestured to bright water. She is my heart. You saved my heart. A quiet gasp went through the warriors behind him. From a leather pouch at his side, the chief drew out a medallion. It was not made of silver or gold, but of a dark, smooth stone, carved with symbols of a time long past and strung on a cord of braided leather. This, he said slowly, is for blood, for family of my father, and his father. Brightwater spoke rapidly, her voice a mix of shock and protest. Her father raised a hand, and silence fell. His eyes found Elara's again. You have no kin, he said, the words a statement, not a question. But kindness knows its own blood. You will be sister to Brightwater. You will be daughter to Stone Eagle. He leaned forward and placed the medallion around Elara's neck. It felt heavy, and strangely warm against her skin. And in that moment, the eyes of the warriors watching her changed. The suspicion was gone, replaced by a look of profound respect. Stone Eagle rose to his full, towering height. He looked around the empty, lonely cabin, at the signs of a child struggling to survive. This place is no place for a daughter of my house, he said. Winter comes. You will not face it alone. You come with us. Elara's world tilted on its axis. The cabin, the river, the memory of her grandmother. Everything she had ever known was suddenly balanced against a future she could not begin to imagine. The terror of another winter alone warred with the fear of leaving her entire world behind. Brightwater limped to her side and took her hand. She spoke softly, a mix of her own tongue and two carefully chosen English words. Come, sister. And then, another. Family. That word, a word she had not truly known in months, struck Elara's lonely heart with the force of a physical blow. But even as a fragile hope began to bloom, doubts took root. Would she ever truly be one of them? Or would she forever be the pale-faced outsider, a stranger in their midst? Chief Stone Eagle seemed to read her thoughts. There is time to think, he said gently, though his eyes took in the cabin's stark emptiness. As if summoned by his words, a cold wind swept through the open door, carrying the scent of snow from the distant peaks. Elara shivered, the memory of the last winter a sudden, biting chill. But the chief spoke of a danger far closer than the winter snows. Soldiers, he said, his voice low. They will find Brightwater's trail. It will lead them here. They will not ask why a settler child is with a native girl. They will only see conspiracy. How long? Elara whispered. Stone Eagle's expression darkened as one of his warriors spoke to him in their tongue. Before the sun is high today, he answered, his voice now laced with urgency. The choice was no longer about loneliness or belonging. It was about survival. Seeing Elara frozen with indecision, Brightwater began to move. She carefully gathered Elara's few treasures. The worn quilt, a small wooden bird her grandmother had carved, a tin box. The chief watched, then nodded to two of his men. You bring the spirits of your ancestors, he said, as they wrapped the items with surprising care. We honor this. But what if I do not belong? Elara's voice was barely audible. For the first time, Stone Eagle smiled, a warm expression that transformed his stern face. Bright water could not cross the river alone, he said simply. You will teach her your strength. She will teach you to belong. You will learn. Together. And then they heard it. A faint, rhythmic drumming on the horizon, growing steadily closer. The warriors stiffened, their hands moving to their weapons. The chief's smile vanished. Soldiers, he said grimly, the time for choosing is over. Elara looked one last time at the rough table where her grandmother taught her to read, at the hearth that held so many memories. Then she looked at Brightwater's hopeful face, and at the great chief who had offered her a future. She felt the solid weight of the medallion against her chest. She straightened her small shoulders and met his gaze. I am ready. The moment the words left her lips, the world moved with a silent, practiced speed. Her grandmother's quilt, her few keepsakes, were secured to a pack horse with care. A gentle, steady mare was led forward, its eyes calm, chosen for a rider who had never known a saddle. Stone Eagle lifted Elara onto the horse's back as if she were made of air. He then helped Brightwater settle in behind her, an anchor in this new and overwhelming world. Hold to your sister, the chief instructed, his voice low. She will keep you on the horse. You will keep her in your heart. As they turned to leave, Elara took one last look back at the small cabin. The morning sun washed its weathered walls in gold, and for a fleeting moment, she could almost feel her grandmother's presence in the doorway, a silent nod of approval for the path her granddaughter had chosen. They moved into the forest not like an army, but like a river flowing through the trees. They followed trails unseen by any settler's eye, their passage marked only by the whisper of leaves. The warriors formed a moving fortress around the two girls, their eyes ever watchful, their presence a silent promise of protection. But it was Brightwater who became Elara's true guide through those first uncertain hours. Despite her own throbbing pain, she leaned against Elara's back, a warm and steadying weight. She would point to a hawk circling on a thermal, to a waterfall that sang a secret song, to a stand of ancient pines that had watched generations pass. These are the old paths, Brightwater whispered, the English words a careful offering. Safe paths. And Elara began to understand. This was not the empty, untamed wilderness she had always believed it to be. It was a home, known and named, every stream and shadow holding a story. As the sun reached its highest point, they climbed a final ridge, and the world fell away beneath them. Spread out below was a valley Elara never could have dreamed. A hidden sanctuary, where a clear river wound through meadows dotted with peaceful lodges. Smoke curled from 100 fires, and the faint sound of life, of voices, and children, and horses, drifted up to greet them. It was the image of peace. It was the promise of home. As they began their descent, a change rippled through the valley below. The peaceful rhythm of daily life faltered. Women looked up from their work, children paused in their play, and 100 pairs of eyes turned toward the approaching party, and settled on the small, pale girl riding with their chief's daughter. Stone Eagle rode ahead to meet a council of elders whose faces were as deeply lined as ancient maps. Their talk was low and urgent, their sober glances drifting often to Elara. She could not understand the words, but she understood the weight of their judgment. Soon, the entire village had gathered, forming a great, silent circle that enclosed them completely. Stone Eagle stood beside Elara. This story is now for the people, he explained, his voice quiet. The village must decide if it will welcome a new daughter. The chief spoke, his voice carrying with the gravity of ceremony, telling the tale of his lost child and the stranger who had saved her. Then, Brightwater, leaning on a warrior for support, stepped forward. Her young voice rang out, clear and true. speaking of a courage that defied fear, and a kindness that asked for nothing in return. When she finished, an old woman, her hair the color of winter snow, raised a hand and spoke. A thoughtful, quiet debate followed. Voices of caution were raised against the wisdom of ancient traditions. And Elara stood at the center of it all, a silent island in a sea of deliberation. But it was not a warrior or an elder who turned the tide. It was a boy, no more than 5 years old, who pushed his way to the front of the circle. He walked directly to Elara, looked up into her face, and spoke a few soft words. And a profound hush fell over the entire gathering. Stone Eagle's voice was thick with unshed tears as he translated. He says, "She has the same lost look in her eyes that he had when his mother walked the star path." A long pause. He says, "Lonely children should not be." The old woman stepped forward again. She looked at Elara for a long moment. Then her hand reached out, not to touch Elara, but to gently graze the stone medallion resting on her chest. When she spoke, her voice was warm, accepting, and final. A true smile, one of deep relief, spread across Stone Eagle's face. Grandmother Willow Whisper says the spirits guide us in ways we do not always see. A pause. They sent you to find our lost daughter. Because they knew we needed to find you. She says a heart brave enough to save a stranger's child is a heart strong enough to become one of our own. And the circle did not erupt. It dissolved. It flowed inward with a murmur of agreement that grew into a wave of quiet welcome, as the wall of faces transformed into a family. Women with kind eyes and gentle hands came forward, offering her soft moccasins and a small bowl of warm stew. Warriors who had seemed so fearsome just that morning now gave her a slow, respectful nod. And children, their initial shyness melting away, gathered near, their curious faces lit by the setting sun. Later, as the deep purple of twilight settled over the valley, Elara found herself sitting by the great fire at the heart of the village. Bright water was at her side, her leg now properly tended to, her head resting sleepily on Elara's shoulder. She was surrounded not by silence and suspicion, but by the low murmur of stories and the soft sound of laughter. The sounds of a family larger than any she had ever dared to imagine. The firelight danced across the stone medallion at her neck. She touched its smooth, warm surface and understood its true nature. It was not a payment for a debt. It was a promise of belonging. The little cabin by the river already felt like a place from a dream, a lifetime ago. The profound, aching loneliness that had been her only companion for so long now seemed like a ghost, unable to touch her in the warmth of this new circle. Here, where two worlds had chosen peace over fear, both girls had found what they were missing. More than safety, more than shelter, they had found home. As the first stars glittered in the vast, dark sky, Elara sent a silent prayer up to her grandmother's spirit. A prayer not of sorrow, but of gratitude. For she knew now, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that sometimes the most extraordinary adventures begin with the simplest act of kindness.